Welcome to A Popular History of Unpopular Things, a mostly scripted podcast that makes history more fun and accessible. My kind of history is the unpopular stuff: disease, death, and destruction. I like learning about all things bloody, gross, mysterious, and weird. Just a quick reminder that you can support me and the show on Patreon. Just look up either A Popular History of Unpopular Things or APHOUT, APHOUT, and you can now also watch episodes on YouTube. So go subscribe to my channel there. I appreciate all the love and support. So, a while back, I did an episode called The Cannibal Plateau, where I told the story of Alfred Packer, convicted murderer and cannibal. Fun times. And if you're a fan of this podcast, then you know that cannibalism stories are some of my favorites. So, I'm sure you wouldn't be too surprised to hear that there are other cannibalism stories from the 19th century, that's the 1800s. I'm not sure what the deal was with the 19th century, but there seem to be a lot of stories about cannibalism. Well, I have a good theory on why that is, but that's an episode for a later date. Or maybe my Patreon. We'll see. But today, I'm going to talk about Levi Boone Helm, a mountain man, an outlaw, a violent murderer, and a cannibal. He was originally from Lincoln County, Kentucky, so he became known as the Kentucky Cannibal, hence the title of the episode. But it's worth mentioning that he didn't really spend too much time there, and he didn't kill anyone in Kentucky either. It just stuck as a nickname. So the plan is to talk all about the Kentucky Cannibal. Who is he? Where did he come from? What kind of cannibal was he? Did he do it to survive in the wilds, or was he a serial man-eater? We've uncovered a lot of potential reasons for man to consume his fellow man, but I think today's story might be a bit different from the norm. If cannibalism could be considered the norm. At least it is on this podcast. Now, as we always do here on the AFL podcast, we'll start with the historical context, what was happening in the 19th century that led to Boone becoming an outlaw. Why was he a cannibal? Did it have anything to do with the times or the environment in which he lived? We need to get a good sense of what was happening around Boone in his history to have a better understanding of how he fits in place, right? The historical context, super important. Can his story be a microcosm of life in the mid-19th century America like Lizzie Borden's was? Or is he more of an outlier? So get ready for another murderous, cannibalism-packed episode, and let's get started. So if we're talking about America in the mid-19th century, our mind usually goes to the Civil War, right? And that's fair. It was a major event that more or less defines the middle of the century. But today's story takes place just before all of that. So we're going to contextualize the story not in the lead up to the Civil War, but in the era of westward expansion. The U.S.'s first big move to expand westward was with Thomas Jefferson's acquisition of the Louisiana Purchase, and it effectively doubled the size of the country by adding lands on the western side of the Mississippi River. And once we got those lands, we started to explore them. Think men like Lewis and Clark with their trusty guide Sacagawea, a Shoshone woman who helped them survive in indigenous territory. And once we get a clearer picture of the potential of the West beyond the Louisiana Purchase, we just started taking over indiscriminately. We took over indigenous spaces in the Great Plains and beyond. We took land from the Spanish and later the Mexicans in the West and the Southwest. We really just kind of manifest destiny all over everyone until we control territories from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Now, in the midst of all of this, we do see hardworking, honest folk making their way west in search of better opportunities for themselves and their loved ones using routes like the Oregon Trail or other similar paths like the Santa Fe Trail. But don't get me wrong, we've seen this go wrong, right? Horribly, horribly wrong. If you were raised in the American education system, public or private, I have to imagine, then you most likely heard about the Donner Party, a group of westward travelers en route to California who got stuck in the snowy mountain passes on the Sierra Nevada mountains. Many died, some made it out alive, but those who did make it out had to resort to cannibalism for survival. It's the classic story of what men and women would be willing to do to survive a horrific situation, and a warning about the dangers of being unprepared in the wilderness. My first podcast episode, was all about the Donner Party, actually, so go back and check it out if you haven't already had a listen. But in that situation, they were mostly just good, honest folk who made some poor decisions and experienced a survival situation that still haunts people to this day. Most people. I'm looking at you, Louis Kesselberg. You were a hot mess. A murdering, cannibalistic hot mess. But anyway, why did people go out west, right? Why into the unknown? Why not, I don't know, Independence, Missouri? Well, for some, the West represented the promise of land and homesteading, a new start, a better climate, certainly better than the dusty plains of the relatively new Louisiana Purchase territory. And that's what led to the first groups of people to travel out west, including the aforementioned Donner Party. But for most people, from mid 19th century on, it was the allure of gold. 1848, gold was discovered at Sutter's Mill, which is in today's Coloma, California, just northeast of Sacramento. News spread back east, and some 300,000 people decided to head out there. It was the California Gold Rush. And it was certainly chaotic, but it also led to new towns, better infrastructure, and a growing economy. Boom towns, we call them. Communities that experienced rapid growth in a short amount of time. And all of a sudden, there were all these people looking to move in, make money, spend money, and build a new life. Towns were popping up everywhere. I mean, even San Francisco started off as a boom town, and look at it now, right? But some of the towns didn't survive the California Gold Rush era from 1848 to 1855, and when the people left in search of better opportunities, those towns became ghost towns. Those are pretty cool to visit too, if you ever find yourself out west and drive past one. I would stop, they're pretty neat. But not everyone who went out west did so with the best of intentions. And that is where we get some classic Wild West movies and stories about outlaws. You know the ones. We've got the Clint Eastwood spaghetti westerns, like A Fistful of Dollars, A Few Dollars More, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, right? Or if you want more modern ones, think about some of the scenes from The Revenant, particularly when they're out west, maybe even Django Unchained, something like that. And there are a ton that take place on or after the Civil War, too. You've got comedies like Blazing Saddles. And can we count the third Back to the Future? I guess so, technically. Basically, any Wild West story where the bad guy outlaws come in from out of town, threaten the people, shoot at them, all that good stuff. So today's story takes place in that period of time in westward expansion, and it's centered around a man who became one of these outlaws, a person who took advantage of the chaos of people heading out west for the California Gold Rush. He, like many others, had wanderlust, and he wanted to make a new start out west, but his violent and psychopathic ways led him down the path of serial killing and cannibalism. So let's dive deeper into Levi Boone Helm and how he ended up as the Kentucky Cannibal. Still too hot. Way too hot. Levi Boone Helm, as I mentioned before, was born in Lincoln County, Kentucky, a good old Appalachian boy. Quick note though, most sources I've read just call him Boone, so that's what I'm going to do too. So I'm going to drop the Levi. It's just Boone Helm. Boone was born in 1828 to a poor family who moved around a lot, wherever the work took them, basically. There were 10 other children besides Boone. So when I say a poor family, I mean a poor family. The father worked pretty hard, but feeding a family of 11 kids, 2 adults, so 13 people, that's pretty tough for unskilled laborers trying to make it in the Midwest. So, whenever they had the opportunity to move somewhere else with the promise of better work, they took it. The family went west from Kentucky to Missouri, where they settled down on one of the routes that took them out west. I think it was the Santa Fe Trail, not necessarily the Oregon Trail. And as such, there was a constant stream of wagons coming into and out of the town, which meant two main things. One, a growing town with a healthy economy. which was good for the family, right? Two, closer proximity to the frontier, which gave the younger boys like Boone an education in things like trapping, hunting, skinning, and carving up a kill. Things like rabbits, right? Boone took to that stuff pretty quickly. Boone also ended up becoming a fighter. His first choice was to use violence to get out of a situation. It's not clear why he was this way. I'm sure there are big holes in his story that are lost to time. Maybe he was just born this way. I don't know. But what we do know about him in these early years is that he would fight at the first sign of an insult or a challenge from another boy, and he would fight with a lot of cruelty, not your typical bullying stuff. As Ryan Green wrote in his book, The Kentucky Cannibal, the true story of an outlaw, murderer, and man-eater, quote, more than once, Boone had to be dragged off another boy for fear that he'd kill him, and more often than not, he'd seek revenge on the ones who had saved him from being a murderer. Despite his savagery, Boone never actually seemed to be angry. There was a cold efficiency to the violence he doled out, like he was just fulfilling his duty. End quote. The passage goes on to suggest that Boone didn't care about having a bad reputation. He liked the attention, but didn't need it. This was just how he was. But he did have a need to prove that he was the biggest, baddest brawler around, fighting all of the men in town, even men who were just passing through town, just to prove that he could win. A big fish in a small pond. He got married, but he was just as violent in his marriage as he was in other aspects of his life. He was so violent that his wife Lucinda resigned herself to dying at his hand when he took it far one day. Too far one day, I should say. Like if he became overly violent, she just kind of figured she was going to die. What a sad state to be in. But when she became pregnant, things changed for her and she filed for divorce, something not super common in mid 19th century America. Divorce back then carried greater societal shame, both on her and the family. But Boone's reputation was so bad that I don't think anybody would have blamed Lucinda for leaving him. In fact, it was Boone's own father who paid for the divorce. And that's telling you something. And in doing so, it bankrupted the Helm family. But they felt like it was their duty, that they were honor bound to provide a life and money for their grandchildren, or their grandchild, I should say. They had one daughter named Lucy, even though they had to give up their American dream in Missouri to do it. So, what did all this mean for Boone? I really like the way that Ryan Green put it. Quote, it was over. He'd destroyed everything that his family had spent so long trying to build. His wife had left him. His parents had left him. Even his brothers and sisters had abandoned him to the fate he was so intent on fulfilling for himself. He was alone now, which meant he had nobody left to restrain him. End quote. Ooh, that's a good line. I like that one. I appreciate a good storyteller. And it was at this point that Boone went from just being a brawler of the streets of Missouri to a murderer. Boone, with few other options in Missouri, made a drunken plan at the local saloon one night with a second cousin named Littlebury Shute. Yes, that was his name, Littlebury Shute. Now, their plan was to head down to Texas and start a new life down there, since, Missouri was kind of no longer an option for Boone. Boone showed up at Littlebury's place the next morning, packed with what little belongings he actually owned on his back, ready to go. But Littlebury had no intention of leaving. Why would he? He wasn't about to be chased out of town. He had a comfortable life in Missouri. He wasn't in trouble with the law, he didn't get in fights, and he didn't want the kind of life that Boone had been offering him. It was just a late-night bar decision. Didn't really mean anything to him. When Littlebury told him no, Boone stabbed him in the heart with his bowie knife. He cleared out Littlebury's house of anything of value, recovered the knife from his cousin's chest, and decided to head out west for California, where people wouldn't know how to find him. When Littlebury's body was found, the sheriff and some others from town set off to find Boone, because of course it was Boone who did this crime, but they couldn't quite figure out where he was. You see, despite all of his bravado and brawling, which gave the facade of a capable, strong frontiersman, he wasn't actually a frontiersman, right? So he didn't know how to survive out in the wilds. So Boone came up with a plan. When the sheriff came upon him, Boone was just skin and bones, trying to drink water from a mud puddle. He was ranting and raving like a madman, and in behaving this way, a doctor managed to sign off on him needing medical rehabilitation because of mental illness, not a jail sentence. So Boone was sent off to a sanatorium, an asylum, which was his plan the whole time because he knew otherwise that he'd be hanged for his cousin's murder. Now, once he left Missouri en route to an asylum out east, he drops that madman act real quick, and he instead decided to play the long game, making friends with the workers at the asylum, gaining their trust. He became a model prisoner. Well, he wasn't a prisoner, right? But he became a model citizen and always did what was asked of him. It got to a point where the orderlies would take him outside to walk near the woods at the edge of the asylum, partly because they pitied him, but also because they trusted him. Each time, while out on a walk, he'd ask to go urinate in the woods, and each time the orderlies allowed him to do so. He would go a little bit further in, spend a little bit more time, and build up trust there as well. I mean, he'll always come back, right? Boone always comes back. Since he always came back, the orderlies were never really concerned and continued giving him these small freedoms. Until the day came where he went into the woods, never came back, and escaped the asylum. And luckily for Boone, in his escape, he ran into a gold prospector on his way out west who helped him out with food and clothes and shelter. But when the prospector was no longer useful to Boone, Boone murdered him. But this time, there was no bowie knife. It wasn't going to be an easy kill. Boone had to rely on his strength instead. So he found a rock, he smashed the guy in the face with it, and then kept hitting him in the face over and over and over again until the deed was done. According to some sources, he kept hitting him until his face, this prospector's face, was just a bloody pulp of nothing but wet skull fragments and squishiness. Ugh. Boone rummaged through his things, took what he wanted, and carried on with his life. Yikes. A ruthless murderer was now loose again with his sights set on the West. He certainly couldn't go back to Missouri, right? But it wasn't an industrious life mining gold in California that he wanted. He would continue finding targets, killing them, and looting their belongings to get what he wanted. Any traveler out there, alone, who came across Boone would usually end up dead. So here's one anecdote for you that will bring us into the next phase of Boone Helm's depravity. In his travels, as you might imagine, Boone would often run out of food. Once he saw a hunter out on the range, and assuming he must have meat back in camp, Boone killed him. But as it turns out, the hunter hadn't actually caught anything yet. So now Boone is beyond starved, sitting at camp, feeling cramped and dizzy from all of the hunger, and then he looks at the man that he just killed. And in this instance, in a case of survival cannibalism, Boone carved him up and ate him. The butchery of it didn't put him off. He had learned how to kill and skin and carve up small game from his time as a kid in Missouri when he was just playing at being a frontiersman. But now, here he was, out on the frontier, trying to survive and having nothing but this freshly killed hunter's body. So he got to work, pulling back the skin, cutting through the muscle, making chops out of the edible parts, and cooking his meal over a fire. And he would make several meals out of this poor guy throughout the night to avail himself of his extreme hunger. So now, the murderous, escaped asylum patient Boone Helm was a cannibal. Mm, just right. Boone arrived in California and started tracking down some family that he knew went out west. He eventually ran into some cousins who were hardened frontiersmen like Boone now was, and in a late night of drinking, the men started bragging about who was the toughest of them all. Classic locker room stuff, I guess. Like I would know. But it was here that Boone said an admittedly badass and kind of spooky line, I'll be honest. Quote, "Many's the poor devil I've killed at one time or another, and the time has been that I've obliged to feed on some of them." End quote. I think it's safe to say that Boone won the night in terms of who was the roughest and toughest man there. Now, Boone carried on his way, drinking and fighting his way across California saloons, picking fights and duels with men as an excuse to keep killing. Eventually, he killed a man in cold blood, in a way that couldn't be excused away as a duel, so he had to flee or else risk being arrested again. From here, he headed north to Oregon. On the way, he told his stories about his frontier experiences, and he started to attract attention from other men like him: bandits, cutthroats, assassins, you name it. He managed to amass a small group of criminals who kind of followed him around, and he learned fun outlaw skills like robbery at gunpoint. And in return, Boone taught his new outlaw companions to murder any witnesses or victims so they couldn't be tracked down as quickly. Fun guy. Great at parties. Now, since there were countless men out west in search of their own riches, there was never a shortage of targets. Boone and his outlaw gang would travel from place to place at little stops dotted along the roads, killing indiscriminately and tossing the bodies off the side of the road. And after the law caught up with them in Oregon, they headed south towards Utah to carry on their robbing and killing. But on the way, they found themselves snowed in at a cabin for a while. Don't worry, he doesn't go cannibal yet. But when they do eventually run out of food, including their horses, they decided that they had to pack up and head out into the snows anyway, or risk dying of cold and exposure in this cabin. So they did. They packed up their stuff and they left. But Boone more or less ditched the rest of his party and they died somewhere out there in the cold. Their clothes were recovered, but the bodies disappeared. It wasn't Boone this time. My guess is that the animals ate them. But one of the guys from the party managed to follow closely enough behind Boone to not get lost in the snow. His name was Burton. When they were on the edge of Fort Hall, which is in today's Idaho, Burton collapsed in the snow. But Boone actually saved him. He dragged him the rest of the way into Fort Hall, short distance, and plopped him down in front of a fire to help revive him. Now, Burton probably thought that he was saved by his outlaw companion, right? Despite being outlaws, there was still a code shared between them, a basic sense of honor and duty to each other. It's just something they kind of followed, right? They still had a code for themselves, even though they were all robbers and pillagers. But we all know that Burton is not safe in the hands of Levi Boone Helm. When Burton had recovered a bit, he saw Boone standing over him with his bowie knife drawn. Boone knocked Burton in the head enough so that he was not completely unconscious, but unable to do anything to stop what was about to happen. And a quick gore warning: this part gets pretty nasty. Okay? Ready? Burton, semi-conscious and still recovering from passing out in the snow, watched and screamed as Boone sawed his leg off halfway down the thigh and then tied off his now stump so he wouldn't bleed to death. Boone then cooked Burton's leg over the fire as Burton fell into and out of consciousness. Boone even offered his victim cooked pieces of his own leg, which is deranged and horrific, but Burton ate some. He must have been thinking that perhaps he would somehow survive all of this and needed to eat to gain his strength, as if Boone was going to let him go after cutting his leg off. Let me repeat this. The man ate cooked chunks of his own leg that his attacker had just sawed off him and cooked in a fire, thinking he'd be allowed to leave when it was all over. Yeesh. I like how Ryan Green puts it, quote, "Boone didn't deign to share his plans with his former outlaw friend and current pantry, but it didn't take a genius to realize that Burton's survival couldn't factor into those plans. He was a witness to many of Boone's crimes and the victim of this final one, but Boone still gave no indication of any malign intent. If anything, he seemed to show more kindness, trying to rouse the other man from his sorrows, and probably the shock of having his leg cut off and fed to him. Tried to at least avail him with jokes and japes, as if his spirits could be raised while he was swallowing down a stew of his own parts. End quote. I like this guy's gross humor. It matches mine. I appreciate you, Ryan Green. Good book. Now, one-legged Burton ended up shooting himself with a revolver that Boone left out. Burton was planning on killing his captor, but there was only one bullet left in the chamber, and he figured that in his state, there'd be no way he could realistically kill Boone. So he killed himself instead. Boone, for his part, was annoyed that his fresh supply of meat, his pantry, was now no longer going to be fresh, so he got to work cutting chunks off of his other leg, and he had to leave the bulk of his former outlaw friend behind since the meat would soon rot. Bummer. Boone then set out, alone this time, except for the leg of his friend in his pack, to Salt Lake City, killing and eating lone travelers along the way as his hunger dictated. And when he got to Salt Lake City, his reputation ended up getting him some work, if you will, I guess. It's work, murder for hire. He was given money by the Mormons running the show there in Salt Lake City to eliminate some of their ne'er-do-wells that were causing problems, which I guess would also be Boone in time. But anyway, Boone killed them, but he was too obvious about killing them because he did it in cold blood, so he was chased out of town. From there, he just wandered town to town, continuing his life as an outlaw murderer, killing as necessary to steal money or supplies, or just because he wanted to, because he's a full-blown serial killer at this point, doing it because he enjoys it. He wouldn't always eat his victims, only when there was no food on the horizon, or if he felt like he needed it, and because he was always on the move, his crimes never really caught up to him. When a local sheriff would sniff him out, Boone would just be long gone by then. Now, eventually, Boone found himself back in California, San Francisco to be more specific. He spent time avoiding bounty hunters and the law, scavenging on farmlands for survival, trying not to be caught or noticed, as low-key as a man like Boone could afford. He was actually taken in by a rancher at some point who pitied Boone and understood that surviving on the frontier was rough. And I mean, Boone didn't hide the fact that he was a murderer and a cannibal. The rancher was just really cool about it. I guess. Not a smart move. Boone was a ruthless serial killer. If a guy showed up on your property saying that he killed and ate other guys, would you take him in? Because I sure wouldn't. I wouldn't take him in. Go away, please. I'm not looking to become your next meal, thank you. Now, Boone spent several weeks there with the rancher, sharing his food, his whiskey, his shelter. And the rancher gave it all, willingly, by the way, without asking for any compensation. No money, no work, nothing. Boone just got to lay about and live the good life for a while, which sounds perfect, right? But after a time, when the bounty hunters and the lawmen stopped sniffing around, Boone got bored. He got bored of the quiet life, of the good life, because that's not what he wanted to do. He wanted to kill people. And instead of just leaving the rancher's home like a normal person, Boone decided to kill the rancher too, because Levi Boone Helm is a psychopathic serial killer. Boone then took everything of value from the rancher's house, mounted a horse, and carried on back north to Oregon, back where he first became a celebrated outlaw. But things were different now. Here's a great line from Green's book, quote, "As outlaws were to normal men, so was Boone Helm to the outlaws. Honor and camaraderie still meant something to the men living outside the law, probably more than they meant to civilized men living within the confines of society. But whatever limits they might have placed on themselves to remain human and whole, Boone had breezed right by them." End quote. It really gives you a good sense of how violent Boone was, that even to the outlaws, he was too much and had a bad reputation that preceded him. After committing several more murders, running from the law to various different states, killing all kinds of high-profile people in cold blood, he made his way to Montana, where he joined a gang called the Innocents, run by a sheriff, funnily enough, named Henry Plummer. But soon enough, a vigilante group, sick of the outlaws running their town, arrested Plummer, Boone, and some of the others from that group. And it was here, in Montana, that Boone would finally be held to account for his myriad of crimes. He was hanged to death on January 14th, 1864, at the age of 35. But, true to form, he couldn't let someone else dictate how he'd die. He'd lived his whole life making his own choices, being violent, and he went out that way too. So, as the executioner came up to kick the box out from under Boone's feet while his head was in the noose, right? You kick the box and you fall and you die. Boone cried out, "Every man for his principles! Hurrah for Jeff Davis! Let her rip!" And then he jumped off the box himself, snapping his neck in the process and dying. And apparently he swung around and knocked all the other men off too, so it's very true to form, just ruining everybody else's experience, right? And Jeff Davis, from his quote, of course, is Jefferson Davis, the first and only president of the Confederate States. Context: his execution happened towards the tail end of the US Civil War, and Boone had once toyed around with the idea of joining the Confederate Army, but didn't want to become confined to a life of not killing indiscriminately and being able to wander around like a maniac. And there ends the violent life of Levi Boone Helm, a psychopath, a serial killer, an outlaw, a cannibal, and an all-around horrible human being. So, does the Kentucky Cannibal represent a microcosm of life in the mid-19th century? I'd say no, not really. He's not even necessarily a product of his environment, because not every man who wandered out into the West, I should say, became a serial killer who had no problem cannibalizing his victims. Like, that wasn't a common experience. It's a pretty extreme reaction to the times, actually. So while Boone can't be explained away by the context this time, he certainly fixed that classic Wild West caricature of the evil outlaw doing harm to the good folks of dusty settlement towns out west, right? Just like with the Donner Party, Boone Helm is just one story of the perils and perilous characters of our American frontier. But it was a juicy story, wasn't it? Thank you for joining me for this episode of A Popular History of Unpopular Things. My name is Kelly Beard, and I hope you've enjoyed the story of the Kentucky Cannibal. Thank you for supporting my podcast, and if you haven't already listened to my other episodes, go check them out. You can also support me and the show on Patreon. Just look up A Popular History of Unpopular Things or AFOUT, and you have multiple ways of joining and engaging. And if you just want to be a lovely person and help support me, there's also a free option. But anything that you can chip in to help, I really appreciate it. And subscribe to AFOUT on YouTube. If you're watching it right now, click on that subscribe button, like and subscribe and comment. It really helps the channel grow. Be sure to follow my podcast, available wherever you listen, so you know when new episodes are dropped. And stay tuned to get a popular history of unpopular things.